How many times do you wake up in the morning and you're like, today I'm not going to yell at my kids. I will not yell at my kids. And then something happens, you get triggered, logic completely goes out the window, and emotions take over. It often feels like we have to muscle our way through parenting, that we have to rely on willpower to give us the strength to not yell, right? It's like, Lord, give me the strength to make it through the day as children are screaming in the background and food's being thrown everywhere. But when we rely on willpower alone, we leave our reactions up to chance. Will we be able to keep our cool? Will we be triggered when our children start yelling? Will we start punishing, shaming, blaming, withholding connection? It's like we're relying on a magic 8 ball to show us the way. So we cannot rely on willpower to parent. We have to build what I call skill power. Hi, my name is Becky Jennings, and this is the Response-Able Parenting Podcast. I give you the transformational tools to stop reacting to your children in the moment and start responding with intention. Hello, everybody. This is the Response-Able Parenting Podcast. My name is Becky Jennings, and I give you the transformational parenting tools to stop reacting to your children in the moment and start responding with intention. I'm very excited to be back here for podcast number 2. We're going to be talking about uncovering our default patterns as parents. It's kind of could be a triggering topic to dive into why we act the way we act. And the other maybe triggering part, or most triggering part about this, is are we going to take accountability and adjust the way that we act in order to benefit our children? All right. So I am a big podcast listener as well. And one of my favorite podcasts is Glennon Doyle's We Can Do Hard Things. And on episode, I believe, like 181, I want to say, they were talking about toxic behavioral patterns. They were specifically talking about Amanda's divorce, but something that I want to make sure I read it so that I get it right. She said something super brilliant, and it really made me think about the context of parenting, and how we can come to the table with so much of our stuff and how we just lay that on top of our children and create another generation of the same behavioral cycles and patterns. But I wanted to dive in. She said, our past experiences are things that are valid to our story, that we need to be aware of them, that they are real. And also, there comes a point in people's lives where we have to stop explaining and excusing behavior for decades and decades based on an unwillingness to confront the issues that we are bringing to the table and ongoing choices that we are exposing ourselves to. This basically takes away all of the accountability to the person, right? So, this is also true for parenting. Our past experiences shape and define the way that we respond to stress, conflict, overstimulation, our own unmet needs and wants. And if we're unwilling to confront those patterns and belief cycles, then we're going to imprint them directly onto our children. And so this is the work of being a responsible parent. And that starts to come with the understanding to acknowledge, to confront, to heal our default patterns, and then make conscious parenting choices to create a new and empowered story and take that aligned action towards that story every single day. Whew, that sounds like a lot, and it's because it is a lot. Many of us are decades into our lives, and we have been responding and reacting from the exact same loop, our patterned loop, forever. We don't know any different. We don't know any better. So this can seem like a huge undertaking. So I want to work through what that looks like, and kind of give some examples from my own life, and really dive into how we can become our own detectives to figure out our default patterns, to see if we can really start to shift these patterns to benefit our children. All right, so let's take an example. Uh, how many times do you wake up in the morning and you're like, today I'm not going to yell at my kids. I will not yell at my kids. And then something happens, you get triggered, logic completely goes out the window, and emotions take over. It often feels like we have to muscle our way through parenting, that we have to rely on willpower to give us the strength to not yell, right? It's like, Lord, give me the strength to make it through the day as children are screaming in the background and food's being thrown everywhere. But when we rely on willpower alone, we leave our reactions up to chance. Will we be able to keep our cool? Will we be triggered when our children start yelling? Will we start punishing, shaming, blaming, withholding connection? It's like we're relying on a magic 8 ball to show us the way. So we cannot rely on willpower to parent. We have to build what I call skill power in order to rewire deeply rooted programmed neural pathways. And once you learn these skills and repeat them at nauseum, because that's what we do as parents, right? We just repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. But when we're rewiring and recreating these neural pathways, we're giving our children a lifelong skill of emotional regulation. And we're not only just giving that to our children, but we're giving ourselves that exact same gift. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I've ever met a person who is emotionally intelligent because their parents took the time to teach them that skill. It's very rare to meet a person whose parents didn't project onto them their own childhood traumas or their own childhood patterns. And so when you do come across somebody who has maybe a high emotional intelligence, you pretty much quickly learn that they had to do a lot of rewiring on their own in order to reach the state of being. So, how do we start the pattern, or sorry, how do we start the process of rewiring? So, from all my research, my training, my parenting experience, I can tell you that it's a lot of work, it's a lot of commitment, and it's not easy. There aren't a ton of shortcuts. So I know that might not sound very hopeful, but it is possible. I'm not saying that the only way is to sit on a therapist's couch and rehash childhood traumas, but in order to truly adjust the lens that we're viewing our children through, we have to get in there. We have to dig in deep and kind of get through some of the shit that you don't really want to revisit from childhood. So today, we're going to dive a little deeper into uncovering default patterns, not just for you as a parent, but as a person. And I wanted to note a few things first that might give you a little bit of hope. So our reactions to our children come, like I said, from our own upbringing, and our unconscious neurological patterns that are deeply rooted in our childhood experience. Our brains are really crazy. Only 5% of our actions, thoughts, beliefs come from a conscious state. 95% of our activity is derived from an automated response system created through a network of neural connections. And these experiences were really rooted between the ages of 0 and 7. You can kind of go a little bit further, but we're really not online mentally until 25. And so these positive and negative neurological pathways are being deeply rooted into our unconscious, and we're operating from this autopilot state. So we're simply reacting to situations in the present day, basically from this unconscious state. But to give you hope, again, the beauty of our brains is that they're not fixed in this state. And through repetitive neural reprogramming and just being in a state of awareness, we can start to override these past patterns, and we can choose to react and respond in a different place. Okay, so let's start to figure out how we can understand and be more present in our bodies. This will give us a chance to be more collaborative, to be calmer, to be more responsible in our household and with our children. So it comes down to learning the art and skill of understanding and grounding ourselves so we can live in empathy, so that we can start to frame the way we have discussions based off needs and boundaries and values and feelings, as opposed to reacting from a triggered state. Okay. Whew, that's a lot, isn't it? So we know that all anybody wants in life is to be seen, heard, and understood. But when we're operating from this place of autopilot and we come to the table and we come to situations with all of our past stuff, and we're viewing these situations through the lens of these past experiences, it doesn't allow us to give, it doesn't allow us to, to move through this in a conscious, thoughtful way. So let me give you an example. Actually, let me quickly go back. I have some notes that I want to make sure that I hit. They're in constant observation mode. They are watching every single thing that we do. And as we see over and over again, all of these visual maps and sound bites get logged into their little brains and get printed back out as adults in the exact same patterns and the exact same belief systems. So they watch how we interact with our partners. They watch how we interact with employees at stores, when we get cut off, when the car cuts us off. And so they start to respond exactly how we respond. So it is a very responsible thing to do as parents, to get into our own patterns and figure out how we can adjust in order to provide our children with a more emotionally intelligent roadmap. It's up to us to teach through modeling how they should show up in the world, right? That's our job as parents, to view what's happening for our children, to view what's happening around our children. It's up to us to be with them in their dysregulation and emotions, as opposed to letting their dysregulation and their emotions trigger our old patterns so that we then, again, imprint those back onto our children. So when we allow our lens to cloud, our past garbage to cloud onto them, that we view what they're doing through these lenses, it's easy to spew onto our children that they're too this or they're too that, rather than understanding that they are developing and growing into humans, right? That they're having their own human experience and we're just putting our stuff onto them. Children are literally our greatest teachers and our biggest mirrors. They show us every little crack in our armor that we constructed through our own patterns to protect our little hearts when we were growing up. So, as these teachers, they're going to show us every aspect of ourselves that needs to be nurtured, that needs to be listened to, and that needs to be healed. And by doing that, we are able to hold more space for our children. So, as we start to uncover our own patterns, we can actually work in synchronicity with our children as they're quite literally showing us our patterns, because our nervous system is going to be on high alert when we're triggered from our children. And that gives us those clues into our patterns. So, the work comes in being able to decipher between the emotions that arise from our own unmet needs versus feeling attacked in our boundaries, feeling attacked in our character, or feeling even attacked in our safety. So let's give a real example of past unemotionally intelligent me, and then my attempts to be emotionally intelligent. So I just want to give a disclaimer. I'm still very much in the throes of working on this. I'm not nailing it 100% of the time. I'm probably not even nailing it 50% of the time, but I'm working on it. And through that awareness, I am kind of chinking away at that armor. So I want to give you an example of something that happened in my very own kitchen. Okay, so I was home with the kids all day, and I could really stop there, and you could all probably feel like, oh, yeah, so she's been emotionally triggered all day. So I was home with the kids all day. I managed to make dinner, and literally, as if the Holy Spirit had swept through the kitchen, I managed to do the dishes as well. So I was feeling pretty accomplished, and I wasn't aware that I had this unmet need, or this need to be validated for my efforts. So, as we know, 95% of our brain activity is operating from this unconscious place. And so I really didn't have any awareness that this was percolating under the surface. So my partner comes home, he sits down, eats the dinner, left his plate on the counter, not even in the sink, and he went to the couch. Whew. So I watched this and I could feel my body getting hot. I started sweating a little bit. My heart rate began to climb. I could feel my jaw getting tight and my hands were clenching a little bit. And a narrative started forming in my head about how ungrateful and disrespectful and unkind I thought my partner was being. Lists of judgments started coming to my brain, and I started you know, having an internal dialogue in my head already of the things that I was going to say out of frustration. Now, nothing negative had been said to me, nothing negative had been done to me. My safety wasn't threatened, but my nervous system was sending this alarm out saying that I was in danger, right? And so I was immediately in the fight or flight zone. I had been taken out of rest and digest, and I was thrust into fight or flight. What was happening below the surface was an unconscious need to be seen, heard, and understood, and that was not being met. I had the need to be acknowledged and validated for my efforts, and that was also not being met. And I was having a very visceral emotional response. So let's just say the non emotionally intelligent me, let's use me as a guinea pig, I could respond with my trusty friend's sarcasm, which I'm very, very good at, and say something like, "Wow, Becky, thank you so much. What a wonderful dinner. Oh my gosh. And you did the dishes too? Oh, that must be so nice. And you did it all without having to fill in the blanks, maybe some snide comments." And this response totally blindsided my husband. It was critical and it was filled with a lot of contempt, and he had no other choice but to defend himself. So then we go around in this pattern, right? We immediately fall into our default pattern as a couple. I yell at him with all sorts of examples of how my needs weren't being met. He yells back, defending himself with all the reasons he couldn't meet those needs, when we're like actually never even saying the words needs or wants or validate or any of that. We're just literally fighting for our character to not be assassinated or judged. I'm sure that sounds familiar. So let's flip it on its head and break down how we can notice those patterns and respond with more emotional intelligence. Okay, so let's say the exact same thing happens. I'm home all day with the kids. I make a dinner. I am able to do the dishes. My husband comes home. He eats the dinner. He puts the plate next to the sink, not even in the sink, and then he goes and sits on the couch. Okay. So my body starts to get a little hot. I start to sweat. I can feel my heart rate rising, my jaws clenching, my hands might be getting tight. That narrative begins to form. I start to have the battle in my head, and I start to think about how ungrateful and disrespectful and unkind. And then, whoop, oh my gosh, that's that pattern again. Every single time this happens, these are the emotional signals and these are the nervous system cues that my body is sending. So you get to be able to start to decipher, oh my gosh, every single time this happens, I start to have, I start to sweat or my heart rate begins to climb. So when you start to notice these things, it can give you an immediate pause button that gives you a second to ground yourself in the moment, take a deep breath, and start to realize that your nervous system has been activated and that you're actually receiving biological data that is now your job to interpret. Are you in danger? Are you being threatened? Are you safe? Okay, you can realize in that moment, okay, I am safe in the house, right? I've been receiving data, data's being sent to me that an unmet need, that I'm experiencing an unmet need in this moment. Okay, so I'm experiencing an unmet need. Deep breath. Okay, I wanted my partner to notice my efforts. That was the need. I wanted my hard work to be praised. That's the need. Okay, take a deep breath and realize that the anger in my chest is data letting me know that I wished the outcome would have been different, right? The anger is the emotion, the anger is data. My therapist talks about this a lot, and I think it's one of the most brilliant ways of looking at feelings and emotions is emotions are data points. They're just telling us if we're happy in this scenario or unhappy in this scenario. So in this scenario, anger was showing me that I did not like the response and my need was not getting met. Okay. So I could now go to my partner and phrase it completely differently in a more emotionally intelligent way. I can say to my partner, "Hey, Charlie, I have an unmet need right now. I know, go with me on this. It sounds very hooey and it sounds very like I would never say that. But trust me, it does change the situation." Okay. So I go to Charlie. Charlie, I have an unmet need right now. If you're open to listening, I think it could really be a good gift to our relationship. I'm feeling pretty angry at the lack of acknowledgement around my dinner efforts. I've had a challenging day with the kids, and despite how intense it was at the house, I still managed to make dinner. I still managed to clean up. I'm sure you had your own experiences at work today that might have caused you to be a little bit slower in this acknowledgement, but I would feel better if my efforts could be seen and validated. So my emotion has been stated that I was angry that my need wasn't being met. And I let him know my unmet need for being validated and for being literally praised for the effort. So it's such a different approach than accusing somebody of being cruel or oblivious or ungrateful. And this really gifts your partner a chance to take in your information without their like spidey defenses rising and putting them on like the massive defense. So this is one of the biggest pattern disruptors I have figured out between me and my partner. I listen to a lot of marriage therapy radio. It's a podcast that I rely on deeply. I think that we would be in a lot deeper trouble if we weren't listening to that podcast. And they talk about patterns as couples, and like you often are having the exact same fight over and over and over again. But something that you can completely disarm and disrupt that pattern with is validation. And even if you don't necessarily agree with your partner's viewpoint, just acknowledging their experience can go a long way. Simple phrases like, "I can see that from your perspective," or "that makes sense to me," or "I believe you." These are such thoughtful statements that shows them that you're choosing to collaborate in your partnership and that you're willing to see another perspective. And even if you don't agree, like I said, you're still willing to listen. This is incredibly disarming and fosters such a great deal of trust and safety within the relationship, and truly one of the biggest pattern disruptors I've ever experienced. Now, this is something that I use to show patterns within a marriage, but two things are true in this experience, right? Our children are witnessing the pattern of conflict resolution between my partner and I, and they're seeing either in example A, they're seeing that when your needs are not met and when you're frustrated and when you're angry, you respond by lashing out, you respond by criticism, you can respond with contempt, versus in example 2 or example B, I don't even remember if I said A or 1, they are learning how to break it down into expressing a need that wasn't met, expressing an emotion, and doing it in a way that comes at the partner with a sense of collaboration and the desire to come to a conclusion. So now that I've started to like break down this awareness within myself, I know that like when my son yells, "No, I'm not listening to you. I'm going to do whatever I want." And that rage that starts to bubble up inside of me because of what he's doing and what he's saying, that the rage isn't necessarily coming up because of his words no. or I'm not listening to you. It's coming up from a past feeling that I was having when I was a child, and I was told that when I would kind of push back, that I was quick, that I was sharp, that I was harsh. And I'm being triggered from a deep childhood personality wound that I felt like I needed to defend. So my son is quite literally mirroring back to me parts in me that still need healing and that still need space. So prior to this acknowledgement, I would rage right back at him. I'd match his intensity with my own. And instead of getting down and trying to figure out the unmet need, I would power over him using all of my authority to get him back in line. Now I'm using my awareness, and I'm not nailing this 100% of the time, but I'm aware of it and I'm working on it. I'm now using that awareness to create more space for these huge emotions that I'm having and that he's having. So I'm honoring my feelings first, as well as my son's, by doing so. And by grounding and becoming more curious and seeking connection versus control, I'm allowing for a lot more opportunity for that emotional intelligence and that emotional growth to come through. My son, not my husband, my son is about to turn 6, and when he was 3, I really started noticing that I was imprinting my patterns onto him. I didn't know how to fix this at the time, but I was really doing it. So he was 3, and I had this visceral realization that I was imposing my childhood patterns onto my son. At the time, I was doing some inner child therapy work, and I was becoming hyper aware that I was showing him conditional love in order for him to meet my very unrealistic high expectations of his behavior. I talked about that a little bit in my first podcast, um, about how we were told about his behavioral issues. And so I had these crazy high expectations that didn't match his developmental ability at the time. I had no understanding of what was appropriate, and I was expecting him to perform exactly as he was told. I was modeling such a perfectionist behavior. I was using sarcasm and tones of voice to get my point across. I was not modeling in any way, shape, or form endless unconditional love and acceptance. I was showing him that all parts of his personality were not valid and were not worth being explored. I was teaching him literally at 3 years old what mask he needed to wear in front of me in order to feel safe, which is really sad when you think about, our the whole human desire. Everybody just wants to feel that safety with their caregivers, to feel seen, heard, understood, and loved. And I wasn't giving that to him. And I wasn't modeling that level of not only self acceptance, but acceptance for him. Okay, let's get back to other default patterns and triggers and stuff like that. I know we've gone through a lot. I have a couple more things that I want to go through. It's just like the science behind how you can start to understand and give yourself a little bit of credit for maybe not knowing any of this stuff. And maybe it excites you to learn a little bit more. So I love the brain science parts of parenting. I love learning about neuroscience. I love learning about um, nervous system regulation. All of this is really awesome to me because I've experienced within my own quest for changing my own neural pathways. I've seen how effective it is. And so to be able to set our children up with those skills so early on, I get like really giddy and geek out about it. So let's talk about what is, how do we recognize those cues and why do those cues exist? So there is a book called Beyond Behaviors, and I'm going to butcher the author's name, but it's Mona, I believe it's Delahouque. Anyway, she goes through an extensive explanation on nervous system reactivity. And I'm going to paraphrase what she talks about, but she explains the work of Stephen Porges, who brought us what's called the polyvagal theory. And it outlines a very deep understanding of stress and calm responses within what's called our autonomic nervous system. Now, I was really excited to learn more about this in my parent coaching classes and courses because my therapist was always talking about the polyvagal theory and autonomic nervous system when she was working with me through all of my previous stuff. And so it was really cool for me to start to connect those dots of like, how does this relate to parenting and all of that. So the autonomic nervous system is basically two different parts that regulates our psychological processing. So it's like these are where you start to feel your like heart rate and respiration increase. This is the rest and digest. This is even sexual arousal. So your autonomic nervous system is all of your like sensory cues. So when my children act in a certain way that triggers the biological nervous system fight or flight. So I guess let's go back for a second. So the nervous system is your rest and digest. That's the parasympathetic nervous system. And then that's when you're, calm and not in threat and you're safe. And then so you have your parasympathetic and your sympathetic. And your sympathetic is when you're going to mobilize into action. That is your fight or flight. That is when you feel threatened. So let's break it down. So when you're getting triggered by your children, you're getting sent the same neurological body cues that are alerting your autonomic nervous system to protect yourself from an oncoming threat. So before you even have time to process in your logical brain that you're being triggered but safe, your heart starts racing, your hands clench, you feel that blood boiling. Those are your cues to start paying attention to. So whether your child is whining because they want another piece of candy, or they're screaming at the top of their lungs because they're refusing to get in the bath or brush their teeth, this is literally going to send you the same stress response cues as you would have received thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago if you were in danger from an animal who was hunting you, basically. So this is probably one of my favorite parts of becoming a better parent, is uncovering these and kind of gamifying, if you will, these nervous system cues, right? It almost becomes comical how you can literally have the same exact biological threat cue for the same pattern that you're experiencing all the time with your children. So it's up to us to start to recognize, and it could literally even be you start writing these things down. My teeth clenched when my child whined. My hands got sweaty when I was overstimulated or overtouched, right? We can start to become our own pattern readers, and it becomes really fascinating how just on the nose, automatic, every single time this happens for us. And I find that really cool because it gives us so much power to take control of the situation. And it gives us also, it gives me hope, because then if I know what it looks like, I can be prepared for it. And I can set up kind of like fail safes to protect myself in those moments. So throughout the day, as our nervous systems are taking hit after hit, and they're unconsciously filtering messages of this is safe or this is threat, um, I want you to take note and really jot down what is going on for you. Because when you're able to get super crystal clear about what your triggers are, what your body's response system is, then you can really create these beautiful protection measures that teach our children how to honor our own bodies, to keep our own bodies safe, to feel grounded in the moment. And then we can really, it gives us so much more space to be there for our children. Okay, so a couple takeaways. Number one, your patterns are deeply unconscious, and they have been imprinted on us from our own parents, and they have been created from our own protection methods from when we were children, from 0 to 7 and all the way on to 25, right? And this is because at some point they did protect us, and they're acting right now because they still think they're protecting us. Right now, it's up to us to follow our nervous system cues and to start deciphering those patterns and start building in those bubbles of protection so that we can give more space, we can get more awareness, and that we can hold more for our children. So when we give ourselves the grace that we're not going to nail it every time, that our triggers have been put in place or excuse me, our responses have been put in place for a reason, it allows us to soften, to give ourselves a little bit more, grace and understanding, patience, so that we can show up for ourselves, maybe the way we were never showed up for in our childhood. So, this is one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle, probably the biggest piece of the puzzle, is that self awareness. And if you gain anything from this podcast today, just being able to start to recognize your nervous system cues that are showing you this lit up path to your exact patterns of protection and the mechanisms your body has put into place to protect you, and to understand that the triggers that are happening with your children are literally triggers that you experienced in childhood. They just take a different form. It's just that same neurological pattern. If you can start to understand that, note it down, pause, and just give yourself that little bit of compassion, you will really start on this path of becoming a responsible parent by just that awareness, that softening, and that deeper understanding of why all of these things are triggering you. And that sets us on the path to going to the next step, which is creating a grounding pattern. All right. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for listening to the Responsible Parenting Podcast. If you like what you heard, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. If you know someone who would benefit from this podcast, I'd be honored if you'd share the episode with them. Until next time, know that you are enough. You are capable. You've made it through all of your hardest days, and we will keep growing on this parenting journey together.